You are watching Co-op for Two. I'm Jesse. I'm here with Greg.
Thanks for having me on your channel.
And this is going to be like take 30 of our discussion of difficulty levels. Now, set the stage.
It is difficult in and of itself to like tackle this.
We've tried this episode several times, but set the stage with the two examples where we've really struggled, or at least confronted the issue of difficulty levels.
Yeah, this kind of whole thing kind of really started because we we were playing a game of Arkham Horror, the card game. We started a new campaign. I think it was the third big campaign. It was the Forgotten something. You're in the jungle. So that game's very challenging, you know. And Jesse had said, well, why don't we step it back and take the difficulty down a little bit? And of course, as a gamer and as a person, I'm like, no. If it can be beaten at this level, I'm going to beat it at this level. Like, right? I'm gonna do this. And you know, we'll get into more about that particular game and system in a while, but we really had as a reasonable person, I'm like, we'll discuss it, you know, like, and essentially, like, after a while, I was like, okay, well, you know what, maybe it makes sense for us to do that, to change the difficulty level, but it is a really big decision as to how a philosophy of the game.
And it's a psychological hurdle to play at the non-normal standard difficulty.
We'll get into that more.
Yes, we will.
And the other instance that really kind of got this whole thing going, and we actually had this discussion to some extent. Jesse whittled it down and just kind of put part of it into a seventh continent discussion. But when we were playing that game, we went in about 13 hours, and dead. Time to start again. And so, you know, that became a thing of like, well, what are our other options here for playing, and what's reasonable? And so what we'll do today is we're gonna talk about all those things and the general concept of difficulty in a game, and then we're gonna look at some games and see like how they handle that topic, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to frame it. We're going to look at some general issues and then talk about how specific games handle it.
Okay.
So I wanted to start at the start, which is sort of, how do you interpret when you open a box and you see it says, here's normal level of difficulty, easy, hard. How do you interpret that normal level? What
were the levels?
Normal, easy, hard.
What's that middle one? I don't even. It's like I feel like it just goes
easy.
Out.
Yeah, the easy.
You don't want to hear it. You don't even want to. You don't even want to consider it.
But sometimes you look at a game and it's got normal level difficulty and you think that's the standard. But you forget that it's not so easy to balance these games. And from my perspective, it's sort of, well, we're sort of jumping questions here. But the worst thing that can happen to a co-op game is for it to be too easy. That's the kiss of death. You play the co-op game, it's too easy, you never want to play it again. So I tend to think start on the hardest level, unless you know it's unbeatable.
You want to be able to beat something on what other people are beating. You don't want to
That's
think
right.
like, oh, well, I kind of beat it. I mean, I beat it on easy. So
But this is what led us, if you'll remember. This was the heart of our Arkham discussion. Because the heart of our Arkham discussion was, we're not going to play, why would we play an easy mode? Like Arkham, we've been playing on normal, and it's brutal. Some of it is brutal, and the luck is so brutal. And you can only play it once and see the story once. So that's when we said...
Arguable.
Right. But our Arkham discussion was, at least the case I made was, it's the description of easy versus normal versus hard is a very arbitrary thing. If the designer just crossed those off and made easy normal, then all of a sudden we can play that. So that was the argument with Arkham. Like, if we're not having fun, if it's too brutally, randomly difficult, why are we punishing ourselves by playing this mode when it's reducing the fun? We should... The bottom line should be, right? Do you not agree with this? The bottom line should be, you play the difficulty level that is the most enjoyable challenge for you.
Essentially, when you're playing the game, if you're not enjoying it, which we were enjoying Arkham, but I mean, it was pretty brutal. Like, we played some of the Gen Con specific quests, and it was just like, you know, it was just, we didn't want to put the time into that game. Like, we were approaching it more casually, right? Like, which is fine, right? Like, it's a very large game. There's a lot going on, and it's a lifestyle type game. We'll talk about that more to come. But like, Jesse ultimately convinced me by, you know, because it was just like, well, if this little thing would we make that one change, We just play on like I think one level down from what we were doing.
Well, let's talk. I mean, just a quick thing. The Arkham difficulty level has to do with how you see this pile of tokens, which can make for any given test you pull out a token, and it's either an instant fail, instant success, or -1, +1. So the only thing that happens with the difficulty levels is you see that pool of random outcomes, and that can be a brutal thing. You make a whole long plan and then you pull out an instant failure. So changing the difficulty there did not make more of a puzzle to solve or make it easier, really. It just took out some of the brutal, extreme randomness.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like in essence, like the concept of this psychological thing is that like we enjoyed it. We enjoyed it more, you know, and that won't go true for all games. But for that game, it was like, this is more enjoyable. And it is funny that we sort of like give ourselves this artificial, you're playing your own game, your own, you know, I mean, people in video game cult, like, it's like, oh, you didn't beat that on hard or whatever. You're like, who cares? You're at home, you're playing something like on your own TV. Nobody's watching you. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
Right? Like, just enjoy yourself, right?
That's
And
right.
so that's kind of like a weird, like, psychological
Which
thing.
isn't the same as saying make it easy. You don't want it, because that's not enjoyable either. But yes, okay, you summed it up well. How does the length of the game affect your decision about what difficulty level to play at, or at least how do they interact, difficulty and length of the game?
So we already kind of broached this subject by discussing Seventh Continent a little bit, which because like it was, you know, you could play, that could be 10, 20, I have no idea. I mean, like we played through 15-hour playthroughs on a number of them, right? Like, so it's a long game, and it could be even more. And so that's a big deal. And there's two games that kind of like, I think, sum it up for me.
Okay.
So one of my favorite gaming experiences, and I might have even talked about this on the channel before, like my brother, who's not really a gamer, and I and my wife, we're playing the game of Fuse, which is a timed, it's either 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And like, you're just frantically trying to do this. It's like you're rolling these dice and you're trying to, and we just kept playing like a little harder, a little harder, a little harder. And it was like, oh, all right, let's play again. Let's play again. We can beat it this time. And it was okay if you got just destroyed or whatever. Like, it's a 10-minute maximum game if you like really felt you were done at any point within there, or if you won or whatever. Who cares? And there's another game that Jesse and I have a real love-hate relationship with, which is Legends of Andor. And the setup for that game is it's awful. I mean, you're rolling dice constantly. You're putting things around. Oh, you're trying to find these points on the map. It's a whole long thing. And the setup, it's grueling. There's no way to make it faster. It's awful, all around awful, and it's not made any easier by the rules and stuff. So essentially, like, if you get half an hour into Legends of Andor and you know you're going to lose, you're like, oh my god, I got to spend 15 minutes setting this game up again, which is terrible, right?
Yes,
and so and Seventh Continent, I mean, is a game length thing where it's just like, well, are we gonna just spend 15 hours getting back to this point again? I mean, it's like,
yeah. So let me jump in a little bit here. Length of the game and setup time, they basically have the same impact on how you approach, or at least how impactful the difficulty level is. And they're both good examples. Arkham also, not so much because of the length of the game, but the fact that there's this narrative story that you can only see once, which also means that that single playthrough has to be right. And I think there are a couple impacts on difficulty level. And it's easier to see it for something from the short games like Pandemic or Fuse or whatever. With those games, there's much less concern about it becoming overly difficult. If you have a game of Pandemic that's overly difficult, you just lose, you start again. You just go again. And it's fine to have a game where the difficulty level is a little random and mostly it kills you, because you don't expect to win every game or every other game. But then the other class of games are the games where there's so much investment in setting up or in going through the narrative or the pure amount of time it takes, such that you have much less tolerance for a game that's randomly much too hard. So you gave Seventh Continent, you don't want to play for 16 hours and then have a death and have to do those 17 hours again. For Arkham, you don't want to play a game and lose the storyline and not be able to replay it. And what was the other example?
Hughes, which is
Or Legends of Andor. You can't afford to play 10 games of Legends of Andor where 9 of them are unwinnable because the setup time is so painful. So for those games where there's so much investment in the playthrough that a randomly too hard game makes it a very unfun experience, then you care much more about finding the right level of difficulty and not allowing too much random variance. Whereas the shorter games, it's fine if one game is unwinnable. If 2 out of 3 games are unwinnable, that doesn't bother you at all. So for the short games, it's not that important. The most important thing for the short games is that it be sufficiently difficult. And it's fine if you go overboard. With those other games, there have to be ways to make it not so punishing.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, like Pandemic, you said like the game is like 45 minutes to an hour. Setup is like 5 minutes. I mean, like if you're 30 minutes in and you're gonna lose, 5 minutes later you're playing in a new game.
So err on the side of making it more difficult. Like don't play Pandemic at a difficulty where you're gonna lose most of the time. But if you played. If you said that same thing with Seventh Continent and said, let me play on the difficulty where I'm going to lose most of the time and have to restart most of the time, that's not going to be fun.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about balancing difficulty for different kinds of players, like balancing for a casual player versus the games like the lifelong lifestyle games. How do you? I mean, it seems like. That seems like why on Arkham we should be playing on easy, because we didn't want to make Arkham our lifestyle game.
Well, I think the thing is, I mean, of course, like if you watch the channel, you know that I often reference like Lord of the Rings, the card game, Arkham Horror, the card game, and Marvel Champions, because those are games that those are lifestyle games or LCGs. I play them solo quite a bit, so I have a lot of playtime live with those, and so I'm always tempted to bring them up. But I also think like that makes a very good discussion point, because this is like if you were designing a game that's going to last for 10 years, it's going to have an expansive card pool that's going to grow and grow and grow, and you're going to play different quests or villains or scenarios or modules that are going to keep coming out. You're designing a game. Right, you're saying this scenario pack for Arkham Horror, or this villain for Marvel Champions, or this quest for Lord of the Rings. Whoever's playing that is going to be you. If you're just in the game shop and you're like, well, I played a couple games of this. Let me grab this one. Let's try it. Let's try playing against Rhino. Whatever. Whatever. Doesn't matter. Like, and you think like, oh, I'll play against the Green Goblin. Let me try this. I think it'll be fun. Now, those players have to be able to enjoy that experience. Like, it has to be winnable. But at the same time, the person that's like a near expert who's been playing like everything that's come out, and they have all the cards, they know the best deck combo, and they've gotten enough reps in the game where they now know the best ways to play, the best cards to use, and they're like super good at it. Well, you don't want them to steamroll everything, because then they'll lose interest in the game. You need those people to enjoy it. So having a lifestyle game of that nature is very difficult to make to please both camps.
That's right. So let's talk about how often you want to win a co-op game.
Well, let's take me out of it for a second. How often do you think most people, like if you were to ask a normal gamer, what do you think they would expect their win ratio to be?
That's a good question. Maybe 50% of the time?
I would disagree with you. I think most people, when they play a cooperative game, probably think they should win the majority of the time. That's what I think. For me, like, and like a lot of people are like, man, we lost a lot of these games or whatever. So there's a couple things. Number one, like, there is the idea of like to me, when you play a cooperative game, you're playing a game where you have an opponent. It's just that opponent is not in, like, they're not there. They're like a spirit or a robot or whatever. They're just like, they're not an actual living, breathing person across the table from you. And so when you play, like, if you think like, hey, if I were going to play a game with you of like Fox in the Forest, like, how many times did I win that with you? I would expect if you and I played Fox in the Forest, you have a little more experience with it, but Like I would guess, like, well, you would win slightly more than I would because you have a little more experience with it or whatever, right? And that we're fairly equal in our, like in our game, like in playing competitive games or whatever. We don't play very many together, but you would think like 50% for cooperative game, right? And so sometimes when you talk about those luck swings and things, it's like man, I can't, if that thing didn't happen, if those cards didn't come out in that combo. But if you had an opponent, it's just like, it's as if they were doing, like when you get like Pandemic, you get 2 outbreaks and they just ramp each other up really fast. Essentially what you're saying is like the opponent was like, oh, I see a good move. Oh, and I can capitalize it here, and that's those swings of luck or whatever, or your opponent making better moves. And of course, it's not a feel good moment when that happens, right? But I would say 50% is the amount of times that you would expect to win. And however, though, you do point out that like earlier that you don't feel good about winning immediately. So it seems like it should be difficult enough to satisfy most people where you can get just close to winning, but not quite win. And then you need to play a couple to do so.
Yeah, I mean, it's a more complicated subject because luck is the other player in this question. When you play a game of Pandemic or any short cooperative game, there are a couple ways to give you that feeling of challenge. And one is to make the game randomly difficult enough that even if you're playing amazingly, if you're playing so well, you're still only going to win 1 out of every 4 or 5 times. And that can be satisfying for a short game. But it can also be frustrating if you're losing through no fault of your own. So, I mean, sort of the safe way to do these cooperative games, the safe way and the easier way to make these games is to make it so that you can't win. Even if you played perfectly, you're never going to win more than 25% of the time, let's say, or even 10% of the time. With a short enough game that's enjoyable enough play, that can still be a wonderful experience. You don't want it to be too easy. So the fact that you're like, let's try again, let's try again, let's try again.
That's the best time when you're playing a game.
That's true. But it would be even better if when you played a game, you're like, I played great and I just barely won. That's the best experience is when you play perfectly, you win. And when you make mistakes, you lose.
Well, there's that Picard quote where it's like, I'm not a Trekkie at all, but like, it's like, I'm going to mangle this quote, so anybody that is a Trekkie might not be very pleased, but it's possible to do everything right and still lose. And that's not something that's life.
Okay, but that's how most cooperative games work. They're set up to be hard enough that even when you play perfectly, you lose. And that's acceptable. That's still a very enjoyable experience. Although I would argue that if you could make a game, it would be better to make a game that was cognitively difficult enough that most of the time you played, you didn't play perfectly and you lost. And when you did play perfectly, you won. That's the ideal scenario. Very few games ever get that. The one game that we play that I kind of feel like that with is Orleans Invasion.
Yeah.
When we play Orleans Invasion, I can't remember a game we've played where I don't look back and say, I feel like I made some mistakes there. And I don't know if I could say that with Pandemic. Sometimes we might play a game that I feel like, well, we made the perfect moves in Pandemic and we still lost. It's still super fun, especially because it's so easy to play a new game of Pandemic. But it's a little more satisfying when you can't play a perfect game.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, like, Pandemic is, not to get too in the weeds here, but like, it's like poker, you can make the best choice, like, right, you make the choice that you should make, and that will be the right choice 99% of the time. And it's like, sometimes, it's like, oh, if I hadn't have folded my 2-7, there was 7-7-2 and I would have had a full house when the flop came down. It's like, well, like 99% of the time that's a foldable hand, and then that 1% is not worth the other times, right? So it does, sometimes it's not going to be that where you're going to make the best move and it's going to win you the game, right?
Yeah. And here's another, we didn't talk about this ahead of time, but I do think it's interesting to think about. There are certain games where the process of playing is so enjoyable, like Pandemic, and the decisions are so enjoyable to talk about and think about that winning or losing doesn't really bother you. And then you might as well play the game at a hard enough difficulty that it's creating interesting choices. Yeah. That the more difficult it is, the more interesting choices. But there are other games that are opposite. And Arkham is a perfect example where when you play Arkham at a harder difficulty, you're throwing in more insta fails. And not only are you not making the decisions more interesting, you're making them less interesting because now you're like, oh, all of that planning was for nothing.
Right, yeah,
so there's an example where
well, now you're getting into luck
difficulty-
versus like difficulty, right?
yes, I am, but that's one of the key
Ways, yeah.
ways that you ramp up difficulties in games is you make the luck more disfavorable to you.
When, and this is just about cooperative games in general, it seemed to be like, because there's cooperative games definitely had like an explosion, right? Like they were
For
kind of
sure.
like nothing. There was one, maybe two, and then it was like the floodgates open, sort of. And I think early on, when you like, there was sort of, I think, kind of the board gaming community kind of had a thing. Maybe you'll disagree with this, but it was sort of like, oh, this is some cooperative game and it's brutal. It's really, really hard. It's impossible to win. And it was like, that seemed to be the kind of
That was
thing-
fetishized for a
yeah,
while.
for sure. So you agree with that?
Yes,
Yeah.
I do.
And it was like people. That's
Well,
what-
your favorite game was one of the ones that
Ghost Stories,
Ghost
yeah.
Stories was one of the ones that sort of embraced that.
Yeah. So I mean, that was definitely a big thing, and I think so. When those designs would come out, they would say
Arkham 2.
brutally Arkham,
Arkham Horror.
second edition.
Second
yeah,
edition.
Yeah. Yeah. That was a whole thing. Like that's what people wanted. They wanted those games that were like impossibly hard to win.
Now, this is a great point. Let's talk about this for a little more and then move on. But I think you're right. And I can see the appeal of that. Even with a game where it's like super random and you're going to lose it 9 times out of 10, because what you're doing is you're sort of paying it forward. You're saying, we lost that game, and you're taking the enjoyment that you would get from winning and you're putting it in a little pile. Each time you lose, that pile's getting a little bigger
that's so
for when
good.
you win.
Wow,
and then when you do win that 10th game, it feels so great to have overcome that.
That's a really great. Wow, that's a great point, Jesse. That's really interesting.
But that's that mode.
Is that a psychological thing? Like
I
have you
don't
read
know
Is
that,
something-
but it does
that's
work.
very interesting.
Now that's gonna appeal to a certain
Sure,
section that's willing to play 10 games.
Well, yeah, you'd need like you want to. It's like being a glutton for punishment. You know. I'll relate a quick story before we kind of transition into some games here. You know, when I first started getting into gaming, and let's turn this video off because as I mentioned, pandemic again. But we were like, we want to try pandemic on the heroic mode, and I remember we spent like my friend Kat and Dimitri and I, we played like 10 games of this thing, and you know, like. It was just like, we're gonna beat this. It was just like this determination. It was like, we already enjoyed the game. We'd won and lost a number of times. And we were like, we're gonna play this a whole load for one day, and we're gonna beat it. Was like a goal. It was like, we're gonna beat that on heroic mode. And now I think, as a modern gamer, having so many more choices, so many more games that you can't even get to them all, both owned or otherwise, I think that sort of white whale of like, we're gonna beat that impossible thing is kind of changed. You know, people don't. You're like, I don't have time for that. I don't have time to sink into that. You know, into that scenario or whatever.
Well, yeah. Pandemic on heroic mode is one of those ones that's like riding the line between luck making it a game unwinnable and it also really requiring you to play a perfect game and get very lucky. And there's still some satisfaction in doing that. We'll have a whole video on our pandemic heroic mode and all that.
Talking about Arkham, can we phase into that?
Yeah, let's phase into some specific games.
so
This is like sort of part 2 of the discussion where we'll talk a little bit more about specific games and how they handle difficulty
So
levels.
Arkham Horror, kind of, not the card game, but the when I'm talking about the tabletop game. When you start that game, you say like, and whether it's second edition or third edition, you've got a number of different elder gods, and you're basically like, we're gonna go against Azazoth this time, or we're gonna go against the King in Yellow, or we're going to go against Cthulhu. You're going to go against one of those, Nyarlathotep. I just said that wrong. But like, you're going to like go against one of those elder gods or demigods or whatever. Like, and that's how the difficulty is set.
So if we were classifying ways that games do difficulty levels, you might call this a sort of scenario-based difficulty level, where you pick one scenario that's rated as easy, hard, medium.
And you talked about Wonder Woman before, and that's another great example where you're like, you pick which you say, I'm going to go against. That one has like 3 different. There's the Cheetah Woman. There's the Ares, I guess.
Cheetah, Ares.
Is that her name? Cheetah.
Cersei. Cheetah.
Her name
Ares,
is Cheetah.
and
That's
Cersei.
it. It's not like
Cheetah.
Chitanda or what's,
No, cheetah.
Yeah,
The
okay.
cheetah.
Okay, so you play against one of those three people, and
Well, that's got a second difficulty level you can tweak on. Each enemy can
Oh,
be
yeah,
played on
absolutely.
easy or normal. But okay,
so. But essentially, like some of the like in that particular game, or in like Arkham Horror, like some of the gods are very difficult because they aren't just coming with this is the enemy, but there's there's a scenario and a set of rules associated with them that makes it harder.
and
more
some are easier than others.
And that's one gateway a game can create a palette of like, making the. But not only is it making it a sense of difficulty, but it's also changing things so that it keeps the decision making fresh and interesting, or in the game
That's
itself
right.
fresh.
That's right.
I feel, and this is, I'm gonna get ready to get mad if you really like, because you might really disagree with me.
Okay.
But having played like Arkham Horror, the card game, Arkham Horror 2nd Edition, Arkham Horror 3rd Edition, Eldritch Horror, Elder Sign. Am I missing any there? Because I played all of them.
You did Eldritch Horror.
Mansions of Madness. Mansions of Madness,
the last
2nd
one.
Edition. Okay, so that's a large. To me, I feel like Fantasy Flight has that Arkham line of games, and they basically say, we're going to make this ridiculously hard or very, 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 very difficult, and that the luck of the game is going to be not all the gods and scenarios and everything are like this. Some of them are easy, obviously, but like it seems like they're saying we're going to make this. It's going to be this difficult, and you have to play perfectly to get to here, and then the luck has got to get you. So in other words, they kind of make it so their way of making the game difficult is to say you can't win this unless you happen to be both do the strategy, but then also get very lucky.
Yes.
And so it seems like if that's the case, like if you said, I'm going to do the exact same thing, the exact same way in the, what's the word I'm looking for at the optimum, that's it. If you do play optimally 4 times, and each of those times, no differences, and you only win one because the dice rolling or the cards came out in the right way or whatever. And it seems to be like, to me, I feel like that Arkham line is very artificial to me. It feels artificial. It feels like...
Well, I mean, you're not going to find any disagreement from me. It's not just that's happened by happenstance. They've decided to embrace this thematic idea of going up against these elder gods that should kill you, should wipe you out, should be almost unwinnable. And that's, in all fairness, I mean, that's what you expect to get. You expect when you walk into these games that you're mostly going to get destroyed, even when you play perfectly. For me, that's not that appealing.
Well, I mean, they're definitely doubling down on that theme, right? Of like the world is going to end, right? And like these are like impossible odds.
But I mean, and it's not just difficult, but as you point out, it's difficult and it's luck playing a large role, and they also lean heavily on this idea that the games should sort of feel oppressive.
Yes.
So everything is sort of like, oh, you made this whole giant plan, you rolled a 1, you lose everything.
Yeah. So I guess like it's kind of like Endgame or Infinity War spoilers, where Doctor Strange is kind of like, I've seen 1 million futures and or 10 million futures, and we win in one of them, and that's kind of, I think, what the Arkham line is trying to get you to feel. And you're right, that's a good point about it's supposed to feel oppressive, and because there's nothing because you're dependent upon that die roll.
But I will say, like you gave an example, like the scenarios in Arkham Horror, deciding what monster to play against. Mansions of Madness has different scenarios. Some are rated easy, some are rated hard. That's a much more enjoyable way to offer the player some control of difficulty. Play the easier one until you get the hang of it. Whereas the Arkham LCG is the least satisfying way to control difficulty. Here, throw these random tokens into your bag that's either going to make your game end on
that's
a
a whole
single drop.
discussion because
But I mean,
there are ways to
those are
mitigate
two
that.
different ways to have dials of difficulty that are just not. One gives you some control and satisfaction, and one is just a huge dose of randomness.
And Horrified does it in the same kind of way as that, but as having different scenarios. But you sort of decide which monsters you're going to fight. So you're kind of like, let's play against this one and this one. This one's a little easier. This one's a little harder. So it kind of takes that idea that you'll get in like an Arkham Horror 2nd Edition or 3rd Edition of like, we're going against this monster or this elder god, but now you're kind of saying, let's go against this guy because let's go against Dracula, he's easier. Let's go against the creature, he's easier. But then let's bring in like Frankenstein and the Bride because they're a little harder, or the Wolfman because he's a little harder. So it's kind of interesting that that's type of system is sort of, it's gotten muddy. The water's gotten a little muddier, right? Like it's a little. There's some variance.
Well, especially because you're combining things. You're saying this and this. But yeah, I guess I would put those both under the umbrella of sort of scenario based or choosing your enemy, but sort of coarse grain control. And now maybe I can lead you a little bit into Marvel Champions because that feels like they've added lots of little dials for controlling the difficulty of Marvel Champions. So you want to tell people a little bit about the...
Yeah, so you're essentially, you're going to pick a villain and you're going to say, okay, we're going to go against, Green Goblin. And then the card will say, well, we suggest you take the Green Goblin deck, and then it says, we suggest you take these other module sets. And you'll take other sets of cards and you'll put it in the deck, and then you'll take the standard difficulty cards, which you'll put in every game that you play, which is like just generic things like the villain attacks you or the villain schemes or something like this, right? And you'll put all those cards and you mix them up and you'll have a deck. And so Marvel Champions basically has, and they do the same kind of thing in the other games, like a little bit, but in this way, like the other games have difficult sets or whatever, but in this one you're able to say, look, we've destroyed Rhino, like we've killed Rhino and Claw a lot. Well, these new packs have modular sets that are much more difficult, and so we're going to take those and mix them in with Rhino, so it's kind of like they have one like Legions of Hydra where there's just all these Hydra soldiers pouring in, and now you're like, okay, well, what if happens if like while we're fighting Claw, a bunch of Hydra people show up and like we have to fight them and fight the other villain or whatever, and so it kind of creates this interesting mix, right, where you're like, you can ramp the difficulty.
You can really adjust the difficulty on a very fine-grained scale.
And also, in a good way, you're actually changing the scenario as well, because you're saying, here's a whole new way to play. This is now, I'm tired of fighting Claw. Well, now I'm fighting Claw, but MODOK has shown up, or Electro has shown up, or whatever. And you're now able to have this kind of interesting new thing, but you're also changing the difficulty. But then it also has a way, now, instead of slipping that standard set in, you can put in the expert set, which is like, it's instead of saying the villain attacks you, it says the villain attacks you, and then draw another card and reveal another card. So that's another problem, right?
And this is what we talked about. Sort of this is a game that's sort of for casual people to jump into it, but also for lifestyle players, and that's
perfectly.
It seems like they really evolved this system to say, how do we make this game that it's going to be challenging enough for someone who's a real expert?
And then the villain will have two stages. You'll fight the first stage and then the second stage. And in the expert way, you'll fight the second stage and then the third stage, which is harder. So it has a lot of ways to tweak that difficulty. Now in the sister games, which we've discussed quite a bit, Arkham and Arkham Horror, the card game, and Lord of the Rings card game, both of those have what they call nightmare scenarios or return to, and that basically has all new cards that you will shuffle into those old decks. You'll remove some and shuffle these in, and it essentially just takes that same core scenario or quest or whatever, and just adds in some more difficult cards to make it more challenging. Right. And so this way, with the new set, because this game is designed lastly, they've really found a way to make it enjoyable. And to solve that problem, how do you make a game that is going on for many years, both enjoyable for a casual person and for the player that's been playing consistently? Because now I know if I play that game on standard, I'm probably going to win. And if I play it on expert, it's going to be a challenge, and I'm probably going to lose more often than I will win. So it's kind of cool the way that they approach that. And it melds a little bit of that we talked about before too, is the way that it kind of melds the, like it's kind of a third generation of that Arkham Horror to Horrify to by putting in those other characters.
Now, here's a question for you, because it's when you look at these, occasionally you'll find a game that's got like millions of little dials for difficulty. This is how I'm thinking about these games. So Marvel Champions has all this fine-grained difficulty you can adjust. Sometimes you'll see a game that's got all these different dials, and for me, it backfires. Like I look at that and I'm like, that feels like there is no actual game. It's just like you could pick any difficulty to make it easy or hard. I feel like there's no proper way to play it. It's just like it's so open-ended. You could make it any degree of difficulty. For some reason, that sort of makes me feel like I've never beaten the game, or it's hard for me to
Sure,
tell when I'm
sure.
good at it because I could just play it on any level of difficulty. But maybe Marvel Champions doesn't have you feeling that way.
Well, I think it's one of those things where like it tells you what sets to use. And if you just want to play that standard way of playing it, then you play it. And you're like, oh, I beat the Green Goblin. That's what they told me to do. I beat it. But then if you're like, you want to get more out of it, and you're like, well, let me try to shuffle these other sets.
And you're
Then
also
sort of-
having, as you pointed out, it's like a different narrative scenario. Whereas if you were just tweaking all these little dials, nothing's changing but the difficulty.
So now you had mentioned this, and I was actually going to bring this up about there's a game Beyond Baker Street, which you and I played. You probably don't really remember too well. I think we only played it a couple of times.
Is this a Hanabi-like game?
It's very similar to Hobby, exactly. And you will each take a roll, and it will have a number on there, and the number is telling you how useful. I think it's like 0, 1, 2, and 3 maybe, and I think maybe even negative. So it's basically saying, that's the handicap, right? Like a higher number is better, or higher numbers worse. I don't remember what and then it has like all these other ways to tweak it. And what essentially you have is almost like a grid. Like there must be 50. I can't. It's been a while since we played it, but there must be like 30 or more different number. You could graph it out and say there's 30 different points of difficulty.
Right,
Each
right.
number you could mathematically come out with like 30 different things and say, let's play a level 12 now. And what that sort of does is, as you were saying, you just feel like not only do you, it's like
not satisfying.
in any way.
Yeah.
In any way. And it's weird because it's like sometimes in life, too many choices is not good.
Yeah,
Like
it's
you're
true.
spoiled for choice. It's too much. It's like
And
just designer, you do the work for me and tell me what's expert.
yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's not clear to me that it should be that way. That having those difficulties should let you be able to find the game that's really challenging for you at that sweet spot. But maybe the problem is that you're not going to play 100 games to statistically figure
Sure.
out what the right difficulty you should play at. So when there's so many dials, you're like, well, we won. Did we win because we played well,
Right,
or
or
because we
because,
got lucky, or because it was too easy? You're not going to sit there and play 100 games. So you depend on the designer to have played those hundreds of games and tell you
But you
what
would think
difficulty.
you would think that like it's sort of contrary to like what you would believe, right? Like it's against your like,
Yeah, you would-
instinct. Which is to say, well, of course, more options.
Give
is
me
better. Like,
more
Yeah,
options.
you would say,
Yeah.
I like to play at a 63. It's like your sleep. What's your sleep number, right? It's like just like that sort of thing, which is like
That's right.
that's how I like to play. And so, but it's not. It's like too much at the beginning of the game. You're like, well, should I take it?
It's too much, and it's too much perhaps because you're not going to play 100 times. If you were going to play it 100 times, then maybe you would appreciate being able to set the balance exactly right. Now, keeping with this idea of talking about specific games and different, it's interesting to look at the different ways that games implement difficulty levels. You sort of mentioned a little bit of one that I want to talk about, which is my favorite way, I think, to have difficulty levels. You mentioned it with Beyond Baker Street, having roles that have
That's what I
different
was
things.
going to do. Yeah.
So there are a couple games, and Pandemic is one,
Oh, boy.
Orleans Invasion is another, where the roles are not always equally as good. And so by changing picking different roles, you're sort of creating an emergent difficulty level in the game. It's not just a different puzzle to solve, but often a harder puzzle. And especially when you get into combinations, like if you play Pandemic and you take the medic and whatever, then you're running roughshod over the game and you can play it at heroic level. Whereas you can then say, well, let's try to take these two characters that probably aren't very good together and see if we can make them work. So Pandemic has it, Orleans has it, you can take different goals. And I love that way of adjusting difficulty because it's not just, the game isn't just saying play this to make it harder. It's saying play this for a different kind of puzzle, which is probably going to be more challenging.
Well, I think that it's almost like the inverse. It's like the negative, or not the negative, but like just the inverse. I said it. I don't know why I did it. But it's the inverse of like the idea of picking the monster or the villain or the elder god of the scenario, or like the Normandy beach or the Stalingrad or whatever. It's like you're picking the opposite. You're picking which characters you're going to use to beat that scenario. And in like a game like Flashpoint, I'm trying to get away from Pandemic. You do like Flashpoint, you're playing different characters to meet that challenge, right? Instead of like, well, this time I want to try to play this character and see how to win with this character. And it goes to the same with like any of the LCGs as well, where you're kind of like, you're going to try a different superhero. I'm going to try a Quicksilver, or I'm going to try the Ant-Man or whatever. And it changes the game's difficulty, but also how you go about winning it. So instead of playing that scenario differently, like you're instead of playing a different scenario, you're playing a different character versus that scenario, which is interesting. It was now, and it works both ways. So when when we play like a Pandemic, we're gonna be like, okay, don't take the medic; it's too easy. We want to try some of these other characters. But then it has the flip side, because then if you go against a scenario that's like unwinnable, like there's like two ways that you can make Pandemic like so hard it's unbelievably hard, and we really was fun because we thought, we're gonna go against this scenario. Let's take the best. And we had a discussion about what the best characters were and how to go about doing that. Right?
Well, this is a really great point, that it seems like part of what we're saying is that you've got difficulty levels in games that operate like dials. Like, let's play this harder one. But then you've got a much more satisfying way where you're choosing between things that create puzzles to solve. And it's not just that it's not that the medic is strictly easier, although perhaps it is, but there are lots of roles that it's not like take this for an easier game. It's take this and it's going to have ramifications, and depending on who it's interacting with, it's going to have ramifications, and so it creates a much more enjoyable puzzle. The dial isn't just adjusting difficulty, it's changing the dynamics of the game, which are going to require you to think differently. So that is the more satisfying. And in Orleans, you're not picking starting player powers, but you might agree, let's try building these buildings. Let's see if we can try this strategy.
And you could see our playthrough on the channel of when we do our review discussion and our playthrough of Orleans Invasion. And in that, like, we said to ourselves, like, we sort of said, okay, these two buildings are like so much more powerful than the others. Let's put them aside.
Yeah.
We're going to try to do this without those buildings, or we're going to try to do pick characters that have harder goals associated to them. And that's not something we even got into yet, which is the idea of like different goals in games. Like a game like Orleans has like.
Well, let's talk about that. That's a good segue. But just to really underline, it's this idea that you're not just changing the difficulty of the game, but you're changing other things that are, as a side effect, making the game more difficult. All right, now let's talk about goals for a second, because that's another way. You see some games, simple games, that are just like, okay, to win this game on easy level, get a score of 17. Like Kahoots, we play, like, you have to get 17 goals to win on normal mode, 20 gold cards to win on expert mode, whatever. And that's a very unsatisfying way to have a difficulty level. You just feel like, well, let's try to do a little bit better.
Sure.
But then you get things like Orleans, where you can pick different goals for your character, and you are making the game harder and easier, right? Even in the book, it says these are a little harder, these are a little easier, but you're completely changing the way you have to play the game to win at those.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like, and it's creating more gameplay for you. It's creating more decision space, which is at the heart. That's the heart of every game, right? Is making a good decision and making interesting strategic choices, right? And that, I think, goes a long ways towards that. And Magic Maze is sort of like, it's a really good way, because like you can introduce, it's in quite a genius way. I mean, it's not the first game to do it, of course, but it's sort of like saying, hey, it's forcing you, or not really, you can jump ahead or whatever, but it's essentially saying, look, you're going to play this first scenario and you're going to win. It's easy. And you're going to learn the game. And then we're going to add in another rule and make it a little harder. And then you're going to play that game, and then we're going to add another rule in, and we're going to make it harder and easier or whatever. And it keeps adding difficulty and also differences and different rules and changing it. But you're learning those as you go. So it sort of folds learning the game, the expansion idea, the different scenario idea, and the difficulty, and it makes like a little path for you.
Yeah.
Which is really cool. And it's a very and for very complicated games, I remember when I first started gaming, Earth Reborn seemed like such an awesome idea. And I'm like, this game sounds amazing. You can like
adds new rules.
You can like torture people for information, and like you could like snipe people and send off nuclear warheads and all this weird stuff. But it's like, it's so complicated, but over 10 scenarios, it teaches you how to play. You just keeps adding a few rules. And that's a heads-up game. It's not a cooperative game. But it's kind of like an interesting thing to say, for the games to say, look, we're going to take the idea of like whether or not, instead of saying, look, don't throw in that expansion, you're like, I'm throwing it in anyway, right? Or don't play on hard, we're going to play on hard anyway. Or play this little intro villain. It just takes all that and says, look, just go along this little story, this little campaign or whatever, and you're going to like increase the difficulty, and we're going to increase the rules, and we're just going to take you along this little road, right? Which is really pretty cool. And also it helps that idea of like, oh, we won. Okay, cool. Oh, that was fun. What's it? It's like the next challenge.
Yes. Okay. I think that's a great point. So another similar game that's got something like that is The Crew, where you've got a large number of scenarios that get more and more difficult. And as you finish one, you unlock the next one. Now,
it's actually quite a bad example since The Crew is like unlosable.
No, I disagree with that. It's still a fascinating challenge. But what I want to focus on is that point of how there's a real satisfaction out of checking it off. Say, we did that. And there's much more, like if you take a game that's got a million of these little dials and you're just like, well, we can play it on easy, we play it on hard. There's no satisfaction there. And especially if it's a game you have to play 5 times before you win, there's a feeling of like, I don't want to do that again. And if you can set up a campaign, a ladder of scenarios that get more and more difficult, the satisfaction of that, of saying, well, we finally beat that, even if it took us 10 times. Now I can check it off, and and now I don't have to play that again. There's something very satisfying about that. And the sort of willingness to put in 9 games to beat it, as long as you don't have to keep doing that, you check it off, that feels satisfying.
Witness does the same thing. I think there's 50 scenarios in that, and they get harder and harder and harder. So yeah, like you would check and those are story based. So like I can't remember my own name when I'm done with some of those. So like I can't imagine being able to remember specifically. But I do think it makes a difference, like in that context. But like, okay, just as like I got to put my little disclaimer in here. I think the Crew is a really cool, unique, awesome game. But I do think like at 2 players, it's not a game anymore because I find it exceedingly easy and to the point of not even being enjoyable.
I would disagree. I would disagree to some extent, but it is definitely a lot easier with 2 player.
Insane easy.
Maybe a good way to end is to talk about sort of what is, and we've talked about this a little bit. What's the perfect difficulty system when you open up a game? And I know for me, it's that ladder of scenarios. For me, the ability to have like a super hard scenario that I'm probably not going to finish, but once I did, I could check it off and say, I finished this campaign or I finished this level. That has me willing to keep trying to claw for that to get to the highest level of difficulty.
Yeah, I think that like a game like, like we mentioned, Magic Maze is really cool that it adds in both. I think the important thing is that as the difficulty ramps up, the decisions have to be made more interesting, right? And that like, the more difficult the game is, probably the shorter the game should be. Like I feel like an hour and a half. I mean, hour and a half is basically a standard game length, I would say.
Okay.
Right, an hour and a half is a normal game. Not for us. We swing for the fences. But like, I think that like, if it's going to be brutally hard, I think an hour is your cap. I don't think you should make, you know what I mean? Like, I mean, and even like Arkham Horror stuff would be like a 3-hour game or 4-hour game, and it would the 2nd edition I'm talking about, and like it's like. It's too, like it's as long as you can make it to the end, okay, and you die from the Elder God or whatever, that's fine. But like, I feel like it is the most satisfying when the difficulty is married to a scenario or an idea, like in general. I think normally if you're trusting, you're putting trust into the designer to have designed a good game in the first place. So you should also trust them when they say normal. Right? Like, and just go for standard. And if the game is not doing it for you, ramp it up to expert, or don't be afraid to go down to easy because you're just enjoying it for yourself, even though, like, most of us don't like that. And you could play it a bunch of times easy and decide, you know what, like, I get it now. I'm understanding what this game is doing on a strategic level, and now I'm ready to because all it does is add game length, or life to the game, right?
Yeah, and I would say if you're designing a game, aim for the dials for that difficulty not to be things like how many goals or how many cards here. Like, you want the dials for difficulty to be much more emergent from choosing different things, either different monsters that behave differently, different roles. And
That could make the puzzle more interesting.
that make the puzzle different and more interesting. And it also, that gives you the freedom to say, I'm going to throw in 10 rolls and some are going to be weaker than others. Don't view that as a negative thing. View that as an opportunity to let players see if they can figure out the puzzle from playing it a different way.
I think theme also makes a big difference here, because like if you think of it like if you're playing like, you know, like World War II and you're just like on some kind of like reconnaissance mission type where you're like trying to find some cows to lead away so you can like milk for your soldiers and meat for your soldiers or something. Well, that's one thing. But then if like it's like we have to hold out in Stalingrad, or you're trying to like storm the beaches in Normandy, you know, that's the kind of thing where like, you know, like, or like, you know, the final boss, you know, you expect the final boss to be really hard, you know. So if you tie those like the difficulties to something thematically, like where you can understand it thematically, then you have an expectation. And expectations is such a huge thing in life in general, right? Like like I thought this movie was going to be terrible, I ended up loving it. I thought this movie was amazing and I hated it. Like if you think like, if they say, look, this is like brutal, this scenario is brutal, really hard to win, you're going to go in with that kind of idea, right? So having those like sort of thematic ties to the difficulty, I think, is a very useful thing. But in general, I still think, I mean, this is so funny because it's like, I'm just wrapping up by saying, always pick normal. I mean, but don't be afraid to go one step down. But if as a designer, I would say different scenarios linked to different difficulties, I would say. Different puzzles.
And if you can put those in a sort of campaign ladder or a ladder of difficulties. One of the things that you came up with this idea, which we'll do a video on at some point. Greg came up with this idea of playing all the pandemics.
Oh, World Tour.
That's right. Well, World Tour was my idea. Don't forget, my title was World Tour. You wanted to call it like Greg's idea of pandemic, but
now you always put stuff on the bottom, changing it. So this time I want you to put on the bottom.
Yeah.
That's not what it was called. That's not what Greg said.
I don't remember what you wanted
have
to
a
call
habit
it,
of
but
doing
I
that.
came up with Pandemic World Tour. Okay. But anyway, what I wanted to point out was the idea of Pandemic World Tour was we were going to play every pandemic in every
We're going to talk
variant.
about that in another video.
And we made checklists. But what I wanted to point out is what we did was we basically made our own ladder for that game, so that once we beat it, like we played Heroic 5 times and then we beat it. And we created that little meta fun part of saying it's a puzzle, we've completed it. And that actually made it fun. It made it more fun than I expected to go through that sequence and be like, okay, each time you checked it off, it was enjoyable. All right, we'll do that. So do you have any comment you want to make on Pandemic World Tour?
Don't talk about our World Tour now.
Okay.
That's my
All
comment.
right, it's too late. But here's another thing. This is what I would say to game designers. Try to figure out a way. This is a good use of computer simulation. There's no reason why a lot of these games can't come with a collection of scenarios of varying difficulties. Like Pandemic has, here's the you can play Heroic, you can play whatever. What's the more extreme than Heroic? Legendary.
Legendary.
Okay, the point is that occasionally they've introduced little scenarios for Pandemic, but there's no reason you can't have computer simulated starting setups for Pandemic that give players a wide range of different puzzles at different difficulties to play. And I'd like to see more of that in games. I'd like to see more.
Well, you're very keen on the app stuff. I mean, you do app stuff for a living, so.
Yeah, well, you wouldn't need an app to play these. You would just need a computer to help you design random starting configurations that made these games
That's maybe
of different difficulties.
Not a difficulty to score.
It is. It's a suggestion to game designers to work harder to make different scenarios of different difficulty.
Well, I do love seeing those books. Like when I remember I first saw that Memoir 44
Scenario
book
books.
of scenarios, and I was like,
That's
that
right.
looks. And I'm not a fan of really the command and color system. Is that what it's called?
Uh-huh.
I'm not personally a fan of that system, so I never really got into it. But I saw that book and I was like, that's amazing.
There's
you can just play through all those things.
I'd like to see more books like that included with games. Like here are some different, and it would just have to be, the rules could be the same. It could just be initial setup that creates a different puzzle.
Sure.
All right. I think we've covered a lot of areas of difficulty.
Well, hopefully this was an interesting conversation to get your brain working if you're a designer, to think about different things that you could do, or if you're just a player, maybe like making you think about why you play things at a certain difficulty level, or maybe to change,
Okay, guys,
Please.
if you like this, please consider liking, subscribing, and even becoming a Patreon supporter if you want to see more of these long discussions instead of just the long playthroughs.
Well, we like discussing things. We could talk about them at length.
Yes, we've proven that.
We have
All right.
definitely proven that.
We'll see you next time. Give the
Are you
foundational
ready for
thing.
this? Did you do something else to this chair? I feel like I'm not up.
Yeah, I glued all the adjustments. No, I didn't,
Did
Greg.
you do something? I feel like you must have done.
I didn't. I
I feel
didn't.
like I'm not-
I've accepted that you're gonna make us sit higher.
Yeah, because I need to be able to like see stuff.
There's nothing there now.
But it's for normal.
That's for normal.
Boy, this chair is a.
Here we go.
I'm bringing my own chair next time.
You are watching Co-op for Two. I'm Jesse. I'm here with Greg.
Thanks for having me on your channel.
And today, sorry, restart.
It is interesting that like it's like the first 30 seconds you got to do 10 times, and then we
It's
talk for like 7
fascinating.
hours.
It's actually fascinating psychological thing. I wonder if there are any studies on it. It is fascinating.
I'm surprised you don't know like the technical term for that.
Well, I'll give you one technical term. It's flow. People talk about being very difficult to get into a flow state of working or playing a musical instrument, and once you get into it, you just go. So
Go what?
You continue.
Go what?
Go with the flow.
There you go.
So
That's the
flow.
answer we were looking for.
You're a little close to the line there.
But I'm not over the line. Are we like we're like kids on
I
a
know,
car
but
trip?
the closer we get, the worse it looks for us. The more weird it looks. Here we go.
Stay on my side.
Should I make like there'll be one line and like a little suggested line?
The suggested donation. Okay.
Today we're going to be discussing. Wow, I just cannot get that out.
Oh my god.
I can't
No,
say
I'll do it, I'll do it, I'll
discussing.
do it.
No, then I get to take over the Arkham intro.
No.
Okay, here we go.
Well, we're gonna have a whole discussion about what goes into that today.
Yeah, it's a hard decision to deviate from the normal mode.
Yeah.
It's a gut. It's like it hurts your pride, right? Doesn't it?
That's Jesse's new watch. Why is it doing that?
I set a timer to tell Greg to stop discussing stuff with my wife and get to filming.
Okay, I'm gonna bring up the seventh continent thing. I do want to.
All right, let's start over, and you can bring
No.
up your seventh
Let's just.
continent.
You want to start the whole thing over?
Yeah.
Oh my god.
Here we go. The nice thing about starting these over is you don't have to actually start over. You can edit. Here we go.
The nice thing about starting over is that you don't have to start over.
I mean, you can.
The nice thing about this
you can
concept is
use
that this concept is irrelevant.
If the
All right,
refilming.
let's go.
Do you want to sort of set the foundation for this discussion?
Yeah. So I don't want to do this again. I'm not telling that story again. It's not gonna be natural. I'm sorry. I just realized I was like, I gotta tell this whole thing again.
All right, so we'll edit in from there.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
All right,
I'm
okay.
sorry. It's it's like wooden and hollow when you're like
I
going
know,
through the
but
same thing.
you got to get good practice at it. You will get good at faking it.
And also, oh boy. And also,
gotta
just to look at like how different games
You're
tackle.
making my editing job so difficult.
Well, just this whole fucking thing. Okay.